Well, good evening, noswaith dda, and welcome to the first literary salon arranged by Swansea University's Cultural Institute. I'm Jon Gower, but that's not important. The person we are here to listen to this evening is Dai Smith. I was introduced to the word Stakhanovite by Dai many years ago. Stakhanov was one of those coal workers who was so productive he became a hero of Russia. And there is something Stakhanovite about Dai Smith, because you look at the sheer industry of the man and you can only step back with admiration. The first book I read by him was The Fed, which he co-wrote with Howell Francis about the South Wales Miners' Federation. And I suppose you could say that that was his most straightforward book. And since then, in terms of the books that have slowly been amassing on his bookshelf, so he has taken a more provocative, cavalier attitude to history, to the telling of history, to looking at ways in which you can take the techniques of fiction to best illustrate the facts of history. Of course, it wouldn't be enough for Dai to just confine himself to writing books. He is, of course, a distinguished academic. He was the Raymond Williams Chair in Cultural History. We think he's still the emeritus chair here in Swansea. And of course, he has been an academic administrator. But even that isn't sufficient, because of course, he has been a very distinguished broadcaster, presented Radio Wales's first-hand arts programme, and of course then went on to be the head of programmes in BBC Wales during a period which I would have to say was probably the most adventurous period in BBC Wales's recent history, because he was commissioning drama by Trevor Griffiths and allowing voice to stuff by Gwyn Thomas, and you wouldn't expect that to be on TV. He is also a very excellent art critic, and of course he has been chair of the Arts Council. And I suppose I'm leaving out some things. But the main thing about his writing is that gradually, over the years, it is impossible to deny the influence of fiction on his history. I've enjoyed many, many conversations with Dai about novels and writing, and we share some enthusiasms. So Dai, welcome, croeso. We're here to talk about The Crossing, which is, in terms of fiction, and I would brook no argument with this, your most ambitious novel to date. And let's start with the title, because The Crossing means so many things. It means crossing a river in Pontypridd, crossing the Atlantic in a liner. In fact, there is a multiplicity of meanings simply to the simple title, The Crossing.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the introduction as well. It reminded me, some time ago I heard the late journalist John Morgan being introduced in a sort of a similar vein, and he said, yes, but I would like to have played outside half of Wales. And I think that must be one of my lost ambitions. It's called The Crossing, you're quite right, because at some straightforward level, all sorts of things go on in the novel. People cross the Atlantic to and fro, as you say. There's the bridge. There's the sense of a movement from a kind of a rurality to industrialization, and then on to post-industrial Wales. But I think what I mean at root is that it's about a time that is completed, and this is the bit of the novel which occasionally is elegiac, but can be sour. I think that Wales, and particularly the industrial south of Wales, which is what the novel centres on, has crossed over, has lost its past, and that past still has its values, which we can take forward with us, and that's my sentimental bit. But losing sentimentality, that I think we are, in Wales, slightly lost in our understanding of what that history has meant, how it has actually impacted upon the people of Wales, and continues to impact upon us even in its absence. So it's a book that is in some ways saying that we need to cross again if we are to effect change. And that, I think, is the most ambitious thing about the book, is that I'm trying to say that after a lifetime of telling that story in history, I'm now trying to tell that history, if you like, in story or in fiction.
Within the book, there are recognizable historical characters, and one of them is Viscount Rhondda.
Yeah. It is fiction, so there's not it's not something that I would advise any young school student to go to for factual issues, but I've tried to put in major actual characters from that past, but to see them through the eyes of other people, so that it's not a description of what they did, it's not linear, it's not narrative. I think it's about consciousness. The characters in the book see each other through I hope, the contemporary perspectives that they bring to it, including Lord Rhondda, or D.A. Thomas as he was, David Thomas, as he began. And at the same time, the book builds to this sense of, if we are to understand what this history has meant, and I really think that it is a meaningful history, then we have to be conscious that an understanding of that history is essential to grasping the ways in which we go forward. So it mixes styles, it's polyphonic, it's multivocal, it's, as I say, not linear, it shifts around. I think one review said that it was challenging if you stuck with it. Well, I feel a bit like that about the actual history itself. Shall I read you a small...
There's a little bit about DA when he was a boy, and that gives us an introduction to one of the voices present.
Yeah. I mean, the opening section is called Before Time, and I'll just go back slightly before that to give you, well, you know, but to give those who are listening to us a sense of what I'm trying to do here. An inquest was held on Monday the 6th instant at the Miners' Arms before the Deputy Coroner Thomas Williams on the body of Thomas Roberts, aged 11 years. Deceased was a door boy. On Thursday 2nd instant, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, while he was at work, a journey of trams loaded with coal passed over his legs. He was taken home and attended by doctors, but died on Saturday. The verdict was accidental death. Cardiff and Merthyr Guardian, Friday the 10th of July, 1863. Richard Thomas, a young fellow, 12 years of age, was working in a stall with his father on Tuesday when a mass of coal fell on him from the roof and crushed him so seriously that he died an hour afterwards. The poor little fellow was only 12 years of age. Cardiff and Merthyr Guardian, Saturday the 16th of June, 1866. And then underneath that, Miscellanea, Taliesin, Arthur Lloyd Papers, Box 16, National Library of Wales, Aberystwyth. Those are actually, of course, real quotes, but my point is that those facts are told in language which makes them fiction, which takes us in a different direction. And then what I move on to in talking about the early years of the young D.A. Thomas is a way in which the fiction, if you like, gives us a different way of looking at the facts. And in this particular bit, his father has sunk a pit over in the Aberdare Valley. It's 1856, he's born, D.A. Thomas, and the boys, his buddies, are all living in the terraces below him, and they call to his house to look, to go into the mountains to find what they call Mae Dai, his treasures. Through all these long summers of their quickening lives in the 1860s, the boys foraged and scavenged together, collecting for him. It was lived as if it were a childhood in common. In the higher stretches of the river, they fished with bamboo poles and string and attached offal with scant success, and they swam naked in the swirling eddies of the river and the deeper pooled water at the bends where the banks were set above the flow. He was not, though all these days of growing together, apart from them, though all understood the difference, the distance. For them, there was a rudimentary fractured schooling, but such as it was only, as they knew, the prelude for work to come. One by one in turn, as they grew old enough, with a year here or there to separate out friends or brothers, they would, as if by magic, disappear from the life they had led. They might have as good as fallen, one by one, into the deceptive mountainside crevices, slits covered in bracken through which you could fall to the earth's center to vanish forever, as did boys and girls, despite all family love and warnings from time to time. Except that these vanished boys re-emerged, by day or by night, aged between 10 and 12, blackened and altered by entering the pits of his father, into which they took dim oil-lit lamps, snap boxes of bread and cheese, and tin jacks of water to work in the dark alongside their own fathers. In the winter, at his bedroom window before dawn, the room crammed with the treasures of summers gone, he would rub a circle into the ice-fronded pane to look down the incline of lawn and road towards the black terraced rows of houses, to see the small, distant, shrunk parade of figures, men and boys, with their handheld lights before them, clump across the frozen grass of white fields and along the cinder path to the colliery shaft, where they would descend and disappear from his sight. So it's that juxtaposition that I was reaching for.
Yeah, so you've got the juxtaposition of the unadorned journalistic account of something happening,
Yeah.
and the lyrical account bringing back memories, which to my mind sound a bit like George Brindley Evans, the Banwen writers, Boys of Gold, but also you're obviously, and I would suggest, channeling your inner Raymond Williams, because there is that attentive eye trained on the landscape and how the boys relate to the landscape and it relates to them.
Well, that's nice of you to say so. And what, at the end of that particular passage, which goes on, obviously, that I read, I then write, and when those who read the book will see that it's full of these chunks, these segments. Biography fragment, Kirk 1958, early days of D.A. Thomas, Taliesin Arthur Lloyd Papers, Box 3, National Library of Wales, Aberystwyth. And it's only when you get to that bit that you, I hope, will realise that I've written there, I don't like the word parody exactly, but I've written in the style of that attempted biography, because again, I wanted to say, this is how this might have appeared to somebody who tried to write a biography of this man without the whole paraphernalia of his life that unfolded later on. So you're given kind of two insights or two ways of looking for it, and the way in which he, known in his boyhood as he was, as Dai, becomes, when he's sent away to public school, D.A. Thomas, he becomes David, and of course then later Lord Rhondda. So there is again that wrenching, that failure to hold things together. I'm not judgmental of D.A. Thomas, the cold capitalist, as a cold capitalist. I am trying to say that he was one of those who, in his hubris, the hubris of his later years, believes that he is in control of his destiny, and believes that he is in control, therefore, of the destiny of this dynamic South Wales up to the 1920s. And of course, he isn't. And that's one of the other things, that he falls into a different kind of crevice.
And of course, you've got another character, the secretary. So this would have been the assistant to Lord Rhondda's secretary, who is organising the life and all the documentation of the life.
Yeah, when I came to think about writing this over the years, you know, when it's confronted over and over again, you mentioned Raymond Williams. Raymond talked about the industrial Welsh novel, and he talks about people trying to write it through family, trying to write it through events, if you like, the melodrama of strikes. Various ways in which a genre, and the problem I think with trying to write such a novel from this perspective now is, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, it's all finished. When Raymond gave that lecture in 1978, we'd had the 72, 74 strikes, which were successful against the then Conservative governments. 1984, 85 hadn't yet happened. It was not at all clear, I would suggest, that history had actually crossed over and passed. When we're looking at it from 2020, it definitely has. And therefore, to write about it as if it's a romance or an epic or a melodrama, or it's an individual story, for me, betrays it. And therefore, I had to find a stylistic means, a structural means to give us a different. So the secretary, who then becomes, as you say, one of the main voices in the book, is a young man born in 1897, who is telling the story from his perspective at the very end of his life. And he becomes, as my novel goes on, more judgmental about the people that he's come across. But he's also displaced. I think I said to you the other day, it's a bit, I'm not writing here, let's say, about an Iron Bevan. I'm South Wales, as I've done. I'm writing about Archie Lush, Bevan's sidekick, and seeing South Wales through his perspective, which is slightly oblique, slightly sidling, slightly sneaky, but actually giving us a different. Shall I read a bit of the secretary's voice?
Yes, please.
And again, it's the tonality of this. This is the secretary actually not right at the end of his life, but he's moved into a care home in 1987. So it's just after the miners' strike. I was the secretary, so invariably people believed what I said had occurred, and in the manner in which I made a record of it. That is a straightforward statement, one made in my best secretarial style. Whether it is a statement about the fashion employed in shaping public memory, rather than a statement of unvarnished fact, if there is ever such a thing as you might wish to say, is something I prefer even now, and almost at the very end of life, to avoid, or at least to obscure. And that is because, truly, I have no reassuring answer to give in final settlement of such a question. No matter, it is in another sense all the same, yet not as to its shaping. The evidence for that which is past, and to be quizzed for the meaning it might tell as history, largely came from such as me, and was filtered through that series of witnessing, which, such as I, necessarily perfected, in order for it to seem as if complete for such as you, who came after the event. I was a secretary, so I made it up. Well, not literally so, of course. I didn't know. How could I construct the wider agenda of which I was a part? But my role was not insignificant, tidying up, guiding, hinting, hiding, giving form and direction to what might otherwise remain in an inchoate state. I formulated the minutes which constitute the public record. I reported it all, or most of it, by which I mean that in my mind, prior to any sift or sequencing into narrative, I held it all. Therefore, not everything needs to be verbatim, does it? As secretary, I was attuned to what was documented and is evidence, not to speculation or fantasy. I transcribed, and so am myself a transcription. And that is in some ways, I think, also an attempted description of what I think we historians have done as secretaries of that society.
You were mentioning an Iron Bevan, and you, in a sense, you don't need to include an Iron Bevan in this because you've already written a series of essays, an Iron Bevan in the world of South Wales. But this new book, The Crossing, does bear a direct relationship, or has a direct relationship, with some of your other forays into fiction, things like Dream On and What Lies Beneath, because they are confluent and they all intersect. And somehow, in my mind, you can't see one separately from the others. They all enmesh.
Yeah, well, I that's what I would hope. Certainly, in terms of the I'll call it the trilogy of fiction, there are echoes in it, but it's kaleidoscopic. That's the attempt anyway, and the segmented stuff is meant to come together a bit like a pinball machine. You know, it kind of it goes everywhere, but ultimately you're still in the machine, and it's still putting the lights on in particular ways. And perhaps we should say about The Crossing, although I've started with that kind of rather serious note, the middle segment is told almost in a kind of a private eye fashion, and the character Billy comes back from America to rediscover his American Wales, or the American Wales that is gone. And there I've adopted certainly a vernacular, which I think is accurate about the way in which people in 20th century South Wales often thought about themselves. So it's an echo of that world, and we attempt in the book, of course, to bring the voices together at the end. So it's a bit of a detective story, with the secretary laying down clues and ultimately people having to judge which of these characters, which of them, and there are various characters, which of them is like D.A. Thomas foolishly thinking he's got a destiny, which of them is caught up in a kind of a mythos, a foolishness, a sentiment, if you like, about their society, which can translate into a politics of utopia, which actually is going to go nowhere. Which of them are despairing and cynical? And I would say particularly my generation of the 60s and 70s ultimately became parasitical upon that history. And that is, I think, the harshest thing I'd say. And then there are those, and a young woman in particular, whom I call Harv, who is attempting to reach a different kind of relationship to that collective society by being more and more conscious of it through the need for change. And can these things come about? So you call it ambitious, and I'll take that as a compliment. If I failed, it's not a failure of ambition.
In gathering all these different voices, and you were saying that you believe that what you've presented is true, if you like, to the voices of modern South Wales. In that, you resemble to me Studs Terkel, who was gathering the voices of America in the same way.
Well, I met Studs in Chicago. He was the same height as me, or actually a little bit shorter. We had a great discussion because he'd come to Wales. He was a big fan of Bertrand Russell's and the Committee of 100 and C&D and all that stuff. And Studs was very left wing with his radio station in Chicago and his oral history. And I set out when I was editor of Radio Wales to go there to look at WFMT, his radio station, to see how he could get some kind of voice of that into BBC Wales. And I think we kind of did that, as you said earlier on, with the poetry and the drama and the Owen Moneys, that we brought onto the station in a different way. Just one story about him. He knew about the Rhondda, by the way, he knew about Gwyn Thomas. Studs, I mean, he was very familiar as a generation of those left-wing communists. Studs was never actually in the Communist Party, but he was close. In Chicago in the 1940s, writers like Nelson Algren, they all knew about what was coming out of South Wales. And they knew of Gwyn Thomas before, and in some senses rated him more than they rated Dylan Thomas. It was, slightly late 1940s. We went into a bar underneath the L in Chicago after the radio thing. And as we went into the bar, a woman said behind the bar, "What are you having, Stud? Your usual?" And he said, "Yeah, my usual." He said, "What are you having?" I said, "I don't know. What's your usual?" And she said, "Studs always drinks double Stolies." Now, I didn't know a Stoli was a Stolichnaya vodka at the time. So I said, "I'll drink what Studs is drinking." So 2 double Stolichnaya vodkas later, we just about, kind of got out of there. They named a bridge after him, which the Crossing in Chicago.
Which is a deft connection again with your own work. There's another sort of presiding spirit, I feel, sort of hovering around the background of this novel, and that's Norman Mailer. And Norman Mailer's fabulous book, The Executioner's Song, did the same sort of thing, where he actually took all sorts of voices to put together the life of Gary Gilmore. And in a sense, you're doing the same sort of thing and reaching for that hard-boiled prose that Mailer and a whole bunch of writers that you've admired over the years have presented, but you've rechanneled it into South Wales. And I think it's most evident when you start to write about boxing.
Okay, well, you've got me in big company there. Again, I met Mailer in the 60s, briefly in New York when I was a student, and I met him again at the ANY Festival. I became a great, I mean, people can have very divided views about Mailer. He was crazy. But for me, he was also somebody that spoke a truth against the easy acceptance of particular genre in fiction. I mean, he broke the rules, he twisted the neck. A novel, I think you said again, it's a novel, it's something new, and he did that particularly. So I'll take that, thank you very much, as a compliment. And the other thing I said before I say about the boxing stuff is that he was one of those American writers, I've mentioned Nelson Algren already, but there'd be Dashiell Hammett and a bunch of other people who spoke to writers in South Wales, like Alan Richards and Ron Berry, far, far more than what they regarded as the rather weak-willed, bendy-kneed, chapel-going, horse, pony, and trap Anglo-Welsh, which they did not like. And I certainly see myself in that role. One of the characters in the book who's real, of course, is Frederick Hall Thomas. And here we go, another fiction. Frederick Hall Thomas is a public schoolboy from Pontypridd who becomes Freddie Welsh, who becomes the first Welshman to become a champion boxer of the world in 1914, when he beats Willie Ritchie in 1914, because he's been bankrolled by Arnold Rothstein, who is the head of the gangs in New York, who teaches the mafia how he's the brain in Damon Runnion's short stories, which Gwyn Thomas, of course, then leeches for his style. All these things interconnect, and the phrasing is, and a number of us have talked about this over the years, is American Wales, that there was a dynamism about the social and economic time in Wales, which actually did create not an actual America in Wales, but created a structure of society and a way of looking at things that was, in those terms, American. And of course, Freddie himself becomes an American citizen. All these things, I think, connect up. In the book, there are a couple of extracts about Freddie's life told in newspaper style, and I leave it to the reader, should we say, to decide whether they were made up or not, because the other thing that I do in cheating in the book is to create a number of papers which are deposited in the National Library of Wales, and I'm busting to know if anybody goes and asks for Taliesin Arthur Lloyd papers in the National Library. Most of my extracts are false. I mean, what appears to be actual history is not. I've made it up. And then there are other bits where, it's the actual stuff. I won't say which is which. This bit is fiction. This is the secretary, age 13, being taken by his father, Mostyn Arthur Lloyd, to see Freddie Welsh fight against Jim Driscoll, the Welsh Cardiff Irishman, who was an amazing boxer at this point, perhaps slightly already past his best. But the two come together in what was the fight of the century, if you like, in Wales. It was held in what was called the American Roller Rink at the top end of Westgate Street. The Tonypandy riots have just occurred. There are troops in the coalfield sent down, by Churchill. There are colliers at this fight. It is an amazing incident, and Driscoll was the classic boxer. Freddie Welsh was the American slugger, and that is what was expected. And this is a boy's view of the fight, but told as part of his memoir later on. So we've got several things going on here. This is 1910. This is a boy's view of the fight, but it's also being told by a man who realizes that that side of his Wales is also gone. So briefly, this is in the middle of the fight. All are surprised, they said afterwards, the men his father's with, but how cunning, they all said. They said it was jab, feint, swerve, jab, all right, but that it was Fred, not Driscoll, who set out his stall that way, that he was almost from the off, quicker too, and Driscoll, minute by minute and round by round, was wrong-footed in this fashion, growing so irritated at the loss of his accustomed rhythm that he made the mistake of trying to overwhelm Fred Welsh, of all people, they said, with a two-fisted all-out attack. Maybe it's what they said had happened. What I, in my first innocence, saw was Freddie Welsh, a fixed and infuriating grin deliberately set on his face, using his longer arms to tangle Driscoll up, then holding Driscoll's deadly left arm at the elbow with his own right and pulling Driscoll downwards into the cave of his own body before turning him with force and all to the blind side of the immobile referee sitting outside the ring square, thumping and thumping Driscoll with the heel of his gloves, more skin-covered than padded then, over and over into Driscoll's kidneys until he could be seen to wince and give up little cries of pain, whilst elliptical swollen welt spread and visibly throbbed across his lower back, with Freddie Welsh smiling and whispering in his ear. We could hear Driscoll's seconds, his cornermen swearing and shouting out protests to the unmoved referee. But this was not the National Sporting Club. This was not London. Halfway through the fight, if that's what it was, Driscoll slipped on the canvas. Right in front of us, he went down onto one knee, just a slip on the damp canvas floor. Freddie Welsh stood over him, and he extended a gloved left hand to let Driscoll rise to his feet. And as he did so, Fred Welsh abandoned any kind of upright stance. He crouched as Driscoll stood erect. He ducked under him, and he rubbed his head upwards as hard as he could, right into Driscoll's face and across his bandaged ear onto the wound of the boil on his neck. And when Driscoll recoiled, he raked his open-palmed glove over Driscoll's eyes, and then he stood off to clutch him once more, swivel his opponent's emaciated frame, and alternately bore into and bang his fist into Driscoll's kidneys again and again. They said later that Driscoll had pissed blood for a week. And then it goes on, and the fight, of course, is called off because Driscoll goes mad and headbutts him, and off they go. Perhaps I could just read this last little bit because he goes mad, and the principal seconds run into the ring. Boyo for Fred, Badger for Driscoll, screaming at each other. You Welsh cunt! You Fenian bastard! You fucking cheating Welsh scum! You dirty fouling Irish pricks! Stools and buckets were hurled across the ring. Blows were given and taken. Beer bottles were being chucked from everywhere towards the ring. Police constables rushed down the aisles, but were tripped, punched, and kicked. My father shielding me from a thrash of whirling men, shouting, "He's but a lad, he's a boy. Make a way, let us through." And they get out into Westgate Street. My father, Mostyn Arthur Lloyd, patriot and nonconformist, his shirt front spattered with the blood of others and his own spittle, his face aflame with whiskey and triumph, dragging me along so fast that I was lifted from the ground, running and laughing alongside him as he yelled out to the world and to anyone who passed us or who opened a window onto the street, "Cymru am byth, Cymru am byth, Freddie Welsh has won, champions of the world." And he held both his arms aloft, a champion. Memoir fragment, 1964, unpublished, Taliesin Arthur Lloyd Papers, Box 1, National Library of Wales, Aberystwyth. Make an appointment.
Because geographies meld, and because you actually have these intersections between different periods in Welsh history and indeed American history, one of the characters who brings us as near to up to date as the book gets is Billy, and you've already alluded to him. Billy Maddox is a photojournalist. He's made his fame, if not his fortune, taking photographs of the miners' strike. And he's coming home, and it's a homecoming novel in many ways, to find out who Harv is, and you've already alluded to Harv, and he thinks that they may be related.
Yes, Billy is of that generation who in the 60s has gone to university. There are others in this as well, and they all have various ways of making their lives, making their careers. And in Billy's case, it partly becomes, as you say, he becomes a professional photographer of some fame across the world, and partly he's called back to see not just whether he's related to this young woman, but whether there's anything left behind for him. And his father, I call in the book his old man, who has been a miner, adult education student, a painter. His father has left him, again, these sour, judgmental versions and views of things. And I kind of take the old man through Billy's role again. Let me give you the old man first. This is Billy remembering his old man. The old man dies in 1985, of course. His old man said you could divide life by decades or by smells and tastes, that these vanished along with fashion in clothes or music or speech, but that they were ever loitering, ready to call up a whole time. More than a tired phrase like the interwar years, he said. That were just boxing things for the left luggage room of historical convenience, he said. He said the 20s for him smelled of damp and decaying plaster as water seeped through a tiny back bedroom, and the sour smell of the lumpy bed he shared with his auntie's 3 sons. It tasted of cold dripping and sweet mashed over tea. The 30s was the acrid smell of cigarettes and the bittersweet taste of Fry's Five Boys chocolate bars, and the mingled stink and taste of underground workings in deep collieries where horse manure and fetid air penetrated mouths and nostrils, and his young bones ached day and night, and his muscles tightened and swelled. He'd escaped that, and with it the slaughterhouse of South Wales, in factory work and elsewhere. The 40s was the taste of fear in the mouth and the smell of burned flesh, filtered into human acceptance with the numb of alcohol and indifference once the killing and the horror was made routine. The 50s, he said, was the last time he knew these things distinctly, and that what he felt for too short a while was newness and happiness, and the taste was of my mother's lips. And I've tried to sum up, if you like, all those decades of history there, but as you said earlier on, that's spelled out in the earlier fiction as well, with All I Know I Cannot Say. And the point about the old man is that he holds, if you like, harsh opinions about the way in which people enjoyed, that's the right word, some of the activities of the activism of the 70s and the 80s. And he is scornful, really, of the lack of any kind of deep empathy with a society, that it's politicking, if you like, rather than politics. And that's the bit I think that might, in the book itself, cause most provocation. Billy takes photographs at the beginning of the big strike, 84, 85, and they are, if you like, conventional photographs, and they make the newspapers, and they are heroic, they are exciting, they are dramatic, they are documenting, and Billy grows increasingly concerned about the society he sees falling apart in front of him, and he makes an exhibition of this work, which he calls in the end No Photographs of Crazy Horse, because of course Crazy Horse, the great Sioux chief, had no photograph ever taken of him. He's one of the few Red Indians who didn't, and Crazy Horse is here a metaphor for South Wales itself. that you can't actually photograph it, you can't actually document it, you can't actually write its history and tell it that way without betraying it. And that is the dilemma, in a sense, I think, of this balance I've been trying to do between fiction and history. And so Billy makes this last effort before he goes away. And he goes away then for 20 years before he comes back in the novel to find Harve. His old man submitted to one last photograph. It was of his clasped hands. The veins were bunched and somehow pulsing, even in their stillness. There were black raised blobs of oil paint flecking his knuckles and staining his nails. The fingers were twined, suggesting a prayer. He never said prayers. They were, for all that, the hands of a maker and of one who had dreamed. Billy would use the photograph as the centerpiece of an exhibition. It came as a shock, since no one had seen the images on which he had begun to concentrate in the dog days of the strike and its sour aftermath. He had no appetite to home in on grief and misery, or even despair and anger. The earlier photographs, which had suddenly brought professional recognition and fleeting fame, those faces featuring defiance, rage, bravery, resolution, unity, exultation, the gestures of speaking and listening, through all the true joyfulness of what was in the end a false and fake scenario, none of those could suffice now, even as negatives. The old man had warned of the vacuous drudgery and drift that was to be the fate of those with no bolt holes left to find. Billy surveyed those inhabiting the ruins and instead picked up the bits and pieces left, the segments that told of their fracture. He shot backs, he blew up fists, he took away the support of arms and legs and just left the torsos. He cast down at feet, he pinpointed an eye or two, he showed mouths shut, he closed off the things and cropped the people that had whispered and shouted and let the ears remain deaf to further entreaty. The photographs he made were a piled up detritus of humanity, a tangle of hair, a sullen neck, an arthritic knee, a discarded banner, a child's extended arm, an empty seat, a white brow, and hands, fluttering, open-palmed and waiting, held together and praying. Something had fled, had drained away, something had been beheaded, something had been killed. He called the exhibition, and the book of it he made, No Photographs of Crazy Horse. And when it was finished, he said goodbye to the old man and left. He never saw him again. He carried him inside himself and would know forever.
Billy's very aware that something has fled the Wales that he visits, because you were talking about the American Wales, which was fashioned with coal being the gold for the Welsh Klondike, and those riven gulches, as Gwyn Thomas called them, of the South Wales valleys, sucking in people to work in the mines. But you actually sort of locate him in a Wales which is changing, because the coal mines are gone, and regeneration is the word on everybody's lips. And regeneration isn't just something that is going to be doled out for the common good, but it invites the most venal nature of people who are out to make a fast buck out of the new euro monies flowing into the valleys.
When I wrote some of this, fortunately, it was done before there were any, shall we say, obvious actions, and that was a good thing.
I should have consulted the lawyers before I even said that.
Yes, but I did. So it doesn't really. It's fiction again, and also it was entirely to do with the way in which I was thinking about the manner in which we have considered. We're moving away here, I think, from fiction, but what does regeneration mean? I mean, I've long argued that what we should be talking about in Wales as a whole is generating energies, generating change, not relying upon the past. And the problem with the words regeneration is that they assume, I think, that the communities that I touch upon in this book, I touch upon the landscape, the architecture, if you like, the ideas, the people, in this kaleidoscopic way, that those communities, in my view, cannot be regenerated, because what made them culturally what they were was something material which we cannot have back, which cannot recreate. So we should be looking, on the other hand, for what are the legacies, what are the values, what are the meanings, what is the meaningfulness of that society that would allow us to actually talk about people being able to live again still within those landscapes. I am not, one of those who believe that, for example, the valleys should be decanted of people and somehow or other left, turned into a national park, which of course has been a serious consideration, not just by individuals, but by governments. I don't believe in that at all. But what I do believe in is that the uniqueness of that world and, yes, of its landscape allows us to see the way in which people can be given the opportunity to create communities on the basis of that history. Now, that's a convoluted way of saying, go back to Raymond Williams, that there is a long revolution still going on here, which is cultural and social, and that we don't solve it by administrative or political means, or even, frankly, just by waving, economic wands. But if you were to ask me, what would you give the Southwards Valleys more than anything else? If you could, of course, I'd find them a different coal. I'd find them a new economic way of not having to worry about all those other factors. But that's cloud cuckoo land. That isn't going to happen. And so if Wales is serious about its nature, if Wales is serious about becoming what we now increasingly call a nation, and when I was growing up, John, very few people used the word nation about our country or about our society. I mean, it didn't come easily to the lips because that wasn't the issue. The issue was, if you like, the square mile, but it was, you came from the Rhondda or Merthyr or Cardiff or Swansea or Pontardawe or whatever it was. We were much more caught up in our particular communities. And I remember going to, for example, Abertrydydd some time ago, and looking, because of John Selway, of course, and the Abertrydydd John grew up in had everything there, whether it was cinemas or
well, foreign films on a Monday in
yeah.
Abertillery and Bryn Mawr and so on,
and shops that meant you didn't have to go down to to Newport or somewhere to Cardiff. So people actually lived within themselves, but it didn't make them parochial. On the contrary, I think it gave them an enormous sense of confidence. You get that very much in Alan Richards' own writing. So I've strayed off the track a little bit there, but that's what I meant about the regeneration. And Billy exposes not so much the criminality. Well, it is criminal, but he exposes the falsity of that thinking, and that's why Harve, who is probably my most sentimental of the characters, but she becomes the vessel that allows us to think that there is a way forward. And at the end of the book, you are left in some doubt as to whether Billy has joined forces with her or gone away again.
You mentioned Harve as a vessel. Another vessel that actually plies its way through the book is actually a transatlantic liner.
Lusitania, yes. Because the secretary, as a young man, goes on board the Lusitania, and of course, it's it's one of those wonderful opportunities for the novelist, if you like. The Lusitania, of course, does sink, is sunk rather by German U-boats off the Irish coast, and on the real Lusitania was the real D.A. Thomas, and his daughter, and they're rescued. There is a famous story about the Western Mail news sheet that appeared on the streets in Cardiff, transatlantic, tragedy at sea, D.A. Thomas saved, which he actually picked up on. So I get the secretary in the book writes a diary about his time on the Lusitania, and there he meets Elbert Hubbard, who's an American philosopher and fabulist, who, again, in real life terms, was a big friend of Freddie Welch's. I wanted to write a biography of Freddie Welch, and is on the Lusitania and goes down with the ship. And so I bring these guys together, again, to show I've used the word hubris already, but I show the way in which that American Wales reached a peak at that point. And the Lusitania is emblematic, I suppose, of this great Britisher success, but also the fact that it's going to fail. I won't read a passage of that, but there are several bits of the diaries, and again it goes into that issue that you've raised, which I'm most pleased with. There are several styles going on here, and several ways in which I try to create that isn't an easy phrase here, but you use the word amalgamation, but it's I'm trying to meld together my imagination with what I know, of the history. I don't think I could have written this book when I was a younger man. I think I needed to know as much as I know in order to write the book. It doesn't mean the book is a success because of that, but it's only possible because of that.
But there are things that you can use because you're using novelistic techniques. For instance, you read us a piece which was redolent with so many scents and aromas and smells which conjure up particular periods. Those things aren't usually available to the historian, but as a novelist, you can tap into those things. And
Exactly.
some of my favorite bits of The Crossing are actually, languorous, detail-filled accounts of great boozers in the Rhondda, which probably won't survive this next period, and they seem to belong even to a more distant past, even than perhaps the one you actually accredit to them in the book. We've got about 10-15 minutes, so please use the chat function to send in any questions. Now, Dai, just before we started, I noticed that behind you, I thought you'd actually done a bit of product placement and set A Writer's World, your book about Gwyn Thomas, in the background. But I'd like to also talk about a bookshelf we can't see behind you, which used to have a lot of copies of the book that David Smith, when you were still called David Smith, and Howell Francis wrote, called The Fed.
Yeah, well, the story was that we had somebody doing some painting and decorating for once years ago, and when I was being useless again, and Dougie, his name was, and he was kind of up a ladder in front of some bookshelves in another room, and there were about, I don't know, 20, 30 copies of The Fed, History of Southwest Miners, in a row, and Dougie looked at all these and he said, "Christ, he said, did you write all these?" Well, sort of.
The one thing that I'd like to share with people who joined us this evening is that you've moved on, but in a sort of almost natural evolution, to writing your next book. And you've had a lot of time, because we've had a lot of time during lockdown. And you're writing what might be called memoirs, but I suspect that you wouldn't actually so label them.
No, I'm using the phrase an autobiographical memoir, which I've stolen actually from Lionel Trilling, who was a professor in Columbia who taught me in 1966-67. Lionel died when he was 70, and he was about to engage on a memoir, which he didn't do. But he said he was going to write an autobiographical memoir, by which he meant that he was going to write about how his personal life, his personal thinkings, intertwined with, should we say, broader, wider paths, swathes of intellectuality, consciousness, or whatever. So what I don't want to do, because I would be bored by it, is to say, and then I did a wonderful Zoom interview with my dear friend, Jon Gower, who, etc., or my kind old friend, or my this, that, or the other. I don't want to write a chronology of that sense. I want to try to find a way to use my consciousness now to look at the younger man that I was, and to ask questions of myself. One of them being as to why my very early ambitions in my 20s to become a novelist led me to become an historian, led me to come back from America to become an historian of Wales, and led me to decide that I had to write history in order to articulate that collective story. I mean, I have no regrets about not writing fiction for years, because I do feel that I was using the same kinds of things within my writing, not just style, but to get that society to a particular pitch. Because, and this is a tough one, because I do believe that, here we go, I'll call it the bourgeois novel, but if you like, the traditional novel, the novel of individual sensibilities and growing up, the sentimental novel and all that sort of stuff, cuts out the experience of working class societies. The characters are always leaving or coming back, and it isn't enough to explain what it is that the world that they're about, or what shaped them, has meant. I think that's why Gwyn Thomas, for example, wrote in such a stylized operatic way. And Ron Berry wrote in such a Baroque fashion, and I'm doing it differently, but I am trying to write about a whole world and not just about individual sensibilities.
Will there be an index in the book, Dai?
Which one?
in your memoirs, because one of my favourite moments in any book launch in recent years in Wales was when Geraint Talvin Davis brought out At Arm's Length, and people bought a book, and the first thing they did was look in the index to see if they were there. They were all there sort of reading the index.
I know that. Yeah, there's a famous story about Richard Burton, isn't there, buying Bleddyn Williams' autobiography, I think it is, and immediately turning to find out if he's in it, because of course he played wing forward at a certain point. No, well, I don't think there'll be an index. No.
No, I remember meeting a very old lady who was reading a book about Stirling Moss, the Formula One racing car driver. And when I asked her why she was reading it, because it didn't sort of go with her, she was sort of in her, well into her 80s. She said, "Oh, I want to learn how to drive faster." I thought, so we've got a couple of questions. One from Ria Cerrynt Phillips. Dai, how did you decide to balance fiction and fact? And did you believe that there were certain facts that you came across that had to be portrayed with complete truth? A lot in that question.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? The latter part, no. I felt I was writing fiction so I could, should we say, alter my facts. I could expand them or not. One small example, I won't read all this, but if I can just give you a sense of where we are on this one. This is meant to be, well, perhaps it is, Hanes y Bobl y Bont, History of the People of the Bridge, Myrddin, 1876, translated from the Welsh by yr athro G. Ellis PSBA, Oxon, M.A. Cantab, 1910, Telias, Arthur Lloyd Papers, so on. So I'm saying here that this is translated from the Welsh. I give the game away, of course, by saying, of course, it's not, but my English is meant to convey that, and it's also meant, and it's about the building of the Pontypridd Bridge. And so just the first few sentences. The ford was there long before the bridges that he built for his better crossing than by stepping stones in dry weather, which was infrequent. The first one, this was in 1746, and so on. And so William Edwards, the stonemason, who was to a minister of religion, a prayerful preacher to a small upland congregation of shepherds and farmers, did raise up, and so on. And this was finally completed by Edwards, the stonemason, in 1756, and its span at over 140 feet as a single bow was a wonder and a triumph. Faith and reason, the signal power over nature, and this bridge stood. Now, those, there are facts there about the building of the old bridge in Pontypridd, which I use then to talk about the way in which the bridge, the Pontypridd Bridge, takes us from one kind of society in Wales to another, but it's all made up as well.
We've got two more questions. One from Elaine Canning. Dai, as both a historian and writer of fiction, how challenging is it to fictionalize history, and how do you make those creative choices?
I think if I go back to where I was some time ago, I felt that I personally, I mean, I've written a lot of, should we say, history, which has been scholarly enough to be footnoted and gone into academic journals and to won me chairs and all the rest of it. So, with no apologies for any of that. However, I felt that I had exhausted the ways in which I could use that history to tell the stories I wanted to tell. And I've turned to fiction, should we say, full on. I've crossed the crossing, because I wanted to find a new means to invigorate the sense of this world that I'm talking about. I don't think it was easy. I've said this before, but I think quite a few of my friends have thought over the years that I've always written fiction. I've just footnoted it and pretended it wasn't. But I've always been as interested in style and structure as I have been in the facts. And yes, I've sometimes bent a few rules as a result of that. I think with the fiction, I can bend as many as I like now.
There's a lovely question here, which is, because we mentioned George Brindley Evans earlier. There's a question from George Brindley Evans, who says, who wants to know, what would Aline Richards, who taught George at the Dove Centre in Banwen, what would he say of your story of South Wales?
He would have gone, stick to history, boy.
Rattling through them now, a question from David Finch. Given the multiplicity of voices in the novel, how did you control the tone of the book?
I think Yeah, I think that's mostly through the secretary. The secretary is, sometimes a rather dry and desiccated voice, but as you read on, and he starts out as a very old man, and at the end he dies as a very old man, but in the middle he's a very young man. He's a man with tremendous passion, and there's a lot of sexuality. I hasten to add, there's a lot of sex in this book, please buy it. So the secretary is the tonality of it, tries to stitch it together, and he's confronted by these kind of tycoon, gargantuan figures, the D.A. Thomas said, crossing the Atlantic, Lusitania. He's also confronted by his inability to actually make a small life that would have been a more satisfying life. And in some ways he's prevented, I won't give the story away, in some ways he's prevented from it. And of course he's related, as we will find out one way or the other, or is he, to Billy the photographer, to the old man, the painter. The lives intertwine, even though they don't always know it.
There's a question here from Dan Llewellyn Hall. So I presume the question is coming from Llanfyllin, where Dan, as an artist, is setting up his own new gallery. He says, "Evening, Dai." Nice chirpy little introduction. "Do you feel we must export our cultural heroes abroad to validate, almost as exotic curiosities, in order to reinstate or reinvent them for us to enjoy within Wales?"
If I've understood the question, Dan, no. I certainly don't think I'm interested in anything exotic or export as such. I think pretty strongly that in as much as, let's just say writers, John, myself, others, we must write, I think, as much from the heart and the head and from whatever truth we can muster, and to hell with anybody else in that sense. I'm interested in the ways in which Irish and Scottish writers, again, I've been on record as saying this before, appear to attract more attention across the Severn Bridge, with some exceptions, than we ever do. Part of the problem, I think, is that when we do attract attention, it's because it's the exotics and the grandiose. And I don't think if we are to mature as a culture, we can allow that to happen. And I do think we are maturing as a culture. I really do. I do think we are, as I said before, an old country that is becoming a new nation.
There's a question from David Britton, which is a request to hear a little of Harv's voice, maybe to buy you a bit of time to find that, Dave. You can find it easily. I should mention that the next literary salon is on the 26th of this month, when I'll be chatting to Alan Bilton about his splendid new novel, and you will have seen a link to all the other cultural activities right at the beginning of the evening. Has that bought you enough time to find an example of Harv's voice?
Yes, David, Harv appears kind of early on because she's left the people who were trying to control her, and so she has quite a lot to say there, and she's also involved in creating various sorts of alternate cultural ways of being, maybe in a slightly naive way, you might think, or not, but she's kind of distancing herself from the norm of political or social behavior, and you are meant to think, that she is somebody who is presenting a new way of looking forward. The bit I've come across is right at the end of the book. This is after they've been to the Canolfan Cymoedd y Dyfodol, the new future centre of the valleys, where sense of the regenerated valleys is being put forward, which in the book you are to understand will be a betrayal of what it's meant to be about. I won't say much about that. So Billy is disgusted by all this, and he goes out into the quadrangle away from the Canolfan, and he's smoking a cigarette. And he's walking across the car park and looking down to what's below him. Further down, the discernible black tumps, the cold conical tips of coal, all tidied up but never gone away, and so on. So Billy drags on his cigarette, and he's going to leave, and Harv appears, and at this point, she doesn't. I don't want to give the story away here, but she doesn't know the relationship that they have. She has thought he is her father, and he may be, but he's leaving. He's turning his back on the whole thing, and he thinks that she has been sucked in again to what I'll call the great corruption. He almost sighed. Harv tapped him. "Are you going? Don't go, stay," she said. "It's done for me," he said. "You can do this, whatever it is you want to do alone, Harv. You can turn it around," he said, not truly believing it, but hoping so for her sake. Use the trust, use the money, use Kerry. You don't need me, Harv. I'm going away. Harv grasped his left hand as he held the car door open. She didn't let it go. She spoke softly to him, almost as if to a child. Do you think I really believe Kerry? She asked quietly. That would be no good. Again, it would fizzle out, or worse, die from the centre. No roots, none. It has to be done differently, slowly, with no let-up, locally, making it new. What was once like that, new and struggling for hope, has been hollowed out. Need to do it again, to get there again, but not in the same way. Has to be different. If we don't believe, we will betray. Ourselves, I mean. You need to be here. Billy looked and said nothing. He didn't want to believe. She let his hand go and he swung into the back seat of the taxi. The driver had left the engine running. Over its purr, before it pulled away, Harv smiled at him. You need us, Billy, she said.
That's almost a perfect place to round things off. Dai, you've been a great champion of writing and literature in Wales, not just as chair of the Arts Council, but by being the series editor of the Library of Wales, through your involvement with the Dylan Thomas Prize. And I feel it's only fitting for me to now be a champion of your own work. I've read all of them. I feel as if I've learnt a lot, but I've learnt about it in a very entertaining way. It's a bit like you holding up history, and it's like a crystal, and as you turn it, it refracts the light and reflects the light, and it illuminates sometimes unheard of corners of our experience here in Wales. So I'd like to thank you for your considerable contribution, which fills up now a substantial part of the bookshelves in this house, but also to congratulate you and salute you on living up to what I think was your ambition when you wrote The Crossing, which was to try and write the great, at least South Wales novel, if not the great Welsh novel. And I think that it is testament to your skills that many novelists don't write with this sort of freshness of form. And you've certainly done that and used form to great advantage in telling this multiplicity of stories. So well done. So do go and buy the book, particularly from independent bookshops in Wales who need your custom. It's a very fine book and would be great to give away as a present with Christmas looming. So Dai, thank you very much indeed for a splendid hour in your company.
John, let me thank you, and let me thank everyone who has listened in. Thank you for your attendance, and it's been a great pleasure.
And to Elaine Canning for organising it all. So thanks to Elaine as well. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Nos da.
Bye-bye.